Welcome, everybody, to Soccer 101. My name is Taylor Rockwell, and with me this week, as always, is Graham Structurally Unsound Ruthven. Graham, how are we today?
I'm sore, Taylor. I'm sore. What happened was, we spoke about this yesterday in the main feed. I went to a concert like a young person. Thought I was still a young person. Turns out I'm not a young person, and I am paying for that with a sore back today, which was developed at said concert. And today's episode is going to be about languages and football clubs and language barriers. It turns out I'm actually speaking my own language now. It sounds a bit like this. As I sit down.
The language of the... you're not even 40. Get out of here. You're a young buck. What are you, like 35?
33, as Joe would say, basically dead.
Oh, well, yeah. According to Joe. When Joe hits 30, it's going to be a rude awakening for him. He'll have finally finished fully developing, I guess, at that point. Is it like 25 when Joe thinks that players stop?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
cool.
Well, I presume that's when he's going to do a Bjorn Borg and retire at 25. I presume Joe, that's when he's old. That's when he'll be old.
See, I found that as I wasn't able to run as fast or do certain physical things, I had to make up for it. And so that's when you learn to add wrinkles to your game. So I always think aging is good. I also think being able to communicate with your teammates is kind of good, which is my clumsy segue to today's episode. It comes from a listener question from Steven Schuler, which was meant for the TSS listener questions, although he does say up front, for a Soccer 101 series, I would love to know how teams handle language barriers between players and staff. These days, a top-flight team might have a half dozen native languages represented in just the starting 11, with more on the bench. Obviously, many players are bilingual or even trilingual, but how do team members and coaching staff communicate with each other in this multilingual environment? Do teams just designate a couple languages that everyone needs to know or learn? Does everyone just have to learn the GM's language? Are there a bunch of translators on the coaching staff? How do teams make this work? Graham, let's start, before we even get to the language, let's start with why this is important. Because I would say that communication and like verbally communicating with your teammates is the most important part of soccer. Certainly scoring a goal and being able to kick a ball, but it's the hardest thing to get kids to do. It's the hardest thing to get new players to do, is say man on, time, turn, all of the things you need to be able to do. Communication is, for me, the most underrated and most important aspect of soccer.
It's funny you mentioned that, Taylor, about playing soccer when you're young. I don't know about you. You might have played for a good soccer team that did these things, but I always thought there were two things that my Dunblane Soccer Sevens team didn't do. One was do anything in central midfield that was just an abyss in there. And the other thing was communicate. Like other teams, the good teams seemed to be communicating all the time, and we were a very quiet team. Not entirely sure how I ended up in podcasting, where I have to talk for 6 hours a week, because I'm generally quite quiet, and I was quiet on the football pitch as well. Taylor, were you a shouter, a screamer?
I was and am, and maybe it's my upbringing that only as an adult, again, you learn new things as an adult, did my center back partner say, you don't have to yell instructions, right? And I was like, no, that's all my coaches did. He was like, yeah, you don't have to, though, which was a good learning experience. But I had to get yelled at by my coaches to learn how to communicate, how to verbalize things. And I think that's totally normal, especially with kids. It's really, really difficult, number one, just to have the confidence to be able to verbalize things and be able to communicate and believe that you're saying the right thing. But I also think for younger kids especially, soccer is such an individual game, and you're so focused on your own individual performance and what you are doing to make yourself play well. It's really hard to kind of pull yourself out of that and recognize that the only way you're going to have a consistently good individual performance is to have teammates who are communicating with you, telling you necessary information, and for you to be doing the same. So it's an understandable thing that is a barrier, but it's a barrier that has to be overcome if you want to make the jump to even moderately successful soccer.
Yeah, and I think once you make that jump, once you make the elite level, I think it becomes even more important, because at a lower level, the kind of stuff you're talking about, Taylor, there, like man on and turn, I guess you could pick that sort of stuff up quite quickly. But at the elite level, you've got tactical instruction. I'm trying to envisage someone sitting in a Unai Emery analysis session when you don't speak the common language. And interestingly enough, Joe Hart was talking about this very subject fairly recently. By the way, Joe Hart becoming one of the... I don't know if he's on American TV, Taylor. I don't know if he's getting any CBS gigs or whatever.
He occasionally gets color commentary gigs, I think.
Right, okay. So he retired last summer playing for Celtic. Him becoming one of the best and most thoughtful TV pundits was not on my bingo card for this season, but he is very good, and he was talking about the season that he went and played for Torino in Serie A. Remember, he gets kicked out of Man City by Pep Guardiola for not being able to play it from the back. He goes to Torino, and basically talking about the arrogance that he had of, oh, it'll be fine, I can't speak the language, the language of football will see me through. And then he tells the story of him sitting in his first team talk before a game and realising that he's got a big problem because he has no idea about anything that the manager is saying or any of his teammates are saying. So, look, I'm sure there are some examples of players who didn't speak a word of the local language when they signed for a team and they found a way to be successful. I remember when Cristiano Ronaldo signed for Manchester United, there's the famous interview of him with Gary Neville, and Gary Neville is sort of speaking on his behalf, and he was a first-team player for Manchester United and went on to become one of the best players in the world. So I'm sure
Gary
there
Neville?
are some exceptional cases. Yeah, Gary Neville, that was one I was talking about. But certainly it makes it easier for you to succeed at any level of soccer, really, if you can communicate well.
And those language barriers that Joe Hart encountered do make coaching really tricky. They do make being a teammate really tricky. There are, I think, some universal terms. Like, I think people understand what shoot means across the board, maybe pass, maybe run, things like that. But I will say this, I am currently playing on an amateur team that has a lot of native Spanish speakers who don't speak as much English. It has been a problem because I assume that step, for example, step up or step two, that player is like one that is like universal. It is not. And then I've also found that trying to get the Spanish translation of what that would be is difficult because if you ask one person, they will tell you the literal translation of like a step that you step on versus the action. And so I think I've gotten 5 different ideas of what I could say.
Taylor,
and
I've
none
got
of them are
visions
correct.
of you like, the Google Translate
Yes,
app. Like,
yes, exactly.
Pressing trigger, like holding the phone out.
I was like man on, for example, is one that I think is universal, but like you could just say hombre. But truthfully, like step, I think somebody was like, oh, it's pisar. So I said pisar, and then my teammate looked at me like, ¿qué? Like, what are you trying to say? Then I tried to say cierro, and that was incorrect, but that was incorrect because my pronunciation was wrong and I didn't roll the R enough, and then it did kind of make sense. All that to say that even within terms that seem universal, sometimes you can get through on nonverbal communication. Sometimes you can get through on very basic phrases and expressions, but it is still trickier than you would expect because explaining nuances of like flick on or like man running in behind, like it can just be, you don't realize how many levels of communication there are when you are playing, when you're just sitting on the sidelines watching. And there are so many different nuances to it. I think on a very basic level, you can sort of play with yes or see or ball. Like, I think that can do it some of the way, but you still have to elevate past that point.
Yeah, and Taylor, you've obviously played abroad in college. You've played soccer in Turkey and stuff like that. So you have much more insight into me. I was trying to think of, was there ever like a foreign player in the teams I played in? The answer to that is no. In deepest darkest Stirlingshire, I was trying to think of Stirling Albion. I can guarantee they only speak English in the Stirling Albion dressing room, and even then, is it actually English? So you have much more of a personal insight to me on this. You have been in a foreign country. Have you been sat playing for a team and thought, I have no idea what's going on here? Or do you get by? Do you find a way?
I'll tell you this. So the Joe Hart experience. So I played just pick up soccer in Turkey quite a bit. And that was usually, you'd get a blend because it was a lot of different nationalities playing. You'd have some Turks. I think I was the only American. You'd have Brits, Italians, Dutch players. And so you'd get this kind of blend hodgepodge that everybody kind of understood what the others were saying. I also played American football when I was in college in Turkey. And that was my Joe Hart experience of, I at that time had a very limited backyard American football understanding of the sport. And sitting at a team talk for an hour where you understand nothing is an exercise in futility. I'm not going to lie. But ultimately, the instructions of like catch the ball and don't let him catch the ball kind of ended up making sense. But it does get pretty boring pretty quickly if you're not speaking the language, and you do have to kind of find ways to get some level of communication across, in my experience.
Yeah, they hand you the playbook, and it might as well be written in Braille.
That's pretty much what my experience was. So, Graham, how common, to continue with a little bit of the background of the question, how common do you think it is to have 5, 6, 7, 8 languages being spoken within a team?
Yeah, so if we look at some of the best teams in the world right now, if we're looking at the elite level, let's look at Liverpool, for example, probably the best team in the world at the moment. As I make it, I look through their squad, they have players within that team that speak Egyptian, English, Spanish, Dutch, French, Portuguese, Greek, Hungarian, Japanese, Italian, and Czech. And that's just first languages as well. There might be some players in there that speak a second language. So that is at least 11 different languages within that Liverpool dressing room. So yeah, this is a day-to-day challenge for clubs at the elite level. I do think it's quite common for teams to adopt a common language within a dressing room. So I remember when Alan Pardew made his. Do you remember that Newcastle team had loads of French players in it? They, for whatever reason, half the team was French for a couple of seasons. They were pretty good at that point as well. And so Alan Pardew, I remember reading, and I went and found this article for my research for this episode. He made English the common language, so a lot of those French players had to have English lessons. Demba Ba was part of those French-speaking players, and his English improved a lot over the time of him being at Newcastle. Mourinho has also done this thing of making the language of the country that he's in the common language in the dressing room. So if he's coaching an Italian team, it's Italian. If he's in Spain, it's Spanish, English. I don't know how that works. I don't know if that still applies when he himself doesn't speak the local language, which I think is the case for him now at Fenerbahce. I haven't seen him speak any Turkish.
It's so okay. Pausing here to go off on a slight Turkish tangent for a moment. Turkish is a fascinating language and is one that is relatively, as difficult as it is to learn any language, relatively simpler, because Ataturk has them shift to the Roman alphabet from the Arabic alphabet, so it's obviously one that you can read if you can read Roman numerals and the like. But then also he has I forget how many linguistics professors and linguistics experts come together, but basically recreate the language in 6 weeks or so. So it's a very simplistic language in a lot of ways. Turks studying for the SATs, which is what I taught when I was there, reading and writing SATs, were so annoyed by how many words English has for so many different words. Because if you want to eat the little breakfast simit, it's like a pastry with sesame seeds on it. That's simit. Mm-hmm. If you are a simit seller, it's like simit ch. If you are a simit seller's cart, it's like simit chala. You just keep adding the endings on. So in that way, it is a somewhat more straightforward language. However, with Mourinho, my assumption is that with those other places, he wanted to learn Spanish and Italian. Maybe he wanted to learn English. I don't know if he wants to learn Turkish. It hasn't seemed like he has loved significant aspects of life in Turkey. So yeah, I do wonder if he still has the common language as Turkish, or if maybe he does and he's just himself not that involved in the locker room conversations.
Yeah, just today he was talking about how he would quite like to coach in Scottish football. So he might have to learn another language, and that might be his most challenging language to date.
So you joke there, but I think that's an interesting one in that even the dialect can become a problem. So you mentioned with Liverpool that Egyptian is spoken. Obviously, that's Mohammed Salah. Egyptian Arabic is massively dissimilar from Arabic spoken in Jordan or Arabic spoken in even Iraq, I think. You're going to get those big differences. And so even there, you might have players.
Or Argentinian Spanish, I think there's quite some difference there as well.
Yeah. So what you end up needing, I think, is some level of a common language. I think that is usually what clubs will go for. And I think Manchester United with Roy Keane and Gary Neville, there are many stories about when they would have 4 French players in the team or 4 Portuguese players. Those players would always want to sit together, after training if you're getting a meal. And Roy Keane would physically make them move to other tables because that's how you get cliques. You get a Portuguese-speaking clique that only hang out together. They're not really part of the team, or you don't have this unified team. So they would intentionally spread them out and then help them learn English or try to learn some of their language along the way. And it is, to my understanding, a multicultural thing, a multilingual thing, that it's not just you're in England now, so you need to learn how to speak English. It's Patrice Evra, I think, learning at least very basic Korean to be able to kind of have more of a back and forth with Park Ji-sung. And that is the other thing that I have always really enjoyed, to continue the Manchester United one for a moment, are all the stories about Park, Patrice Evra, and Carlos Tevez all being best friends, even though none of them speak the same common language. Yeah. I think Park knew some Spanish. Evra knew a good amount of Spanish. Tevez obviously spoke a ton of Spanish, or was fluent in Spanish, I should say. I think eventually they all learned more English, but you would have them having these broken language conversations in different languages, but they would improve along the way because they spent time together. So I think you will get a common language that prevails, but then you'll also have other bits and pieces that kind of pepper in too.
And when you tell that Roy Keane story about him breaking up tables of French players, like in the real world, that's maybe not advisable, but team sports, there are different rules. Yep. And so things like, I know it's a cliche, but things like team spirit and all pulling in the same direction, that they matter, at least on some level. So, as I say, there are different rules. I think you want to avoid cliques within a dressing room. I think in the modern game, they particularly if we're talking like Premier League clubs and Champions League level clubs, I think they maybe account for more languages than previously, maybe in the Roy Keane era. So I was reading about Brentford, how they do things. Brentford, by the way, their site has a whole load of... I keep going to the Brentford well on Soccer 101 because they have a whole lot of information on there on their website. And basically, they will provide translations of team meetings for all their players. And apparently, Thomas Frank speaks a bunch of languages as well, because of course he does. That seems like a very Thomas Frank thing to be able to do.
Well, he's German, and Germans, I think, are born speaking 5 languages somehow.
Yeah. He's just good at everything, Thomas Frank. But I am very jealous. But surely that makes things easier for him. And I think we spoke about Mourinho already. I think a lot of the elite level managers in the modern game will speak multiple languages, and so that will facilitate communication between different sets of players.
Yeah, and then with that you will have. To your point, you'll have like translated team talks. You will have translators in teams. You'll have them in the locker room even. I remember when the Sounders won MLS Cup, they had multiple translators from multiple different languages. I will say, and this is very anecdotal, in my experience, a lot of the time the translator is sort of unnecessary. A lot of the times by like a full season in a league, the player will speak enough of the language, certainly to be able to communicate with teammates, to be able to communicate in-game. I think sometimes maybe it's not enough to fulfill media obligations or to do full-on interviews, but I've definitely had moments where a translator would translate a player's like whole like explanation of what happened in a game, and then reporters will walk away, and that player will turn and start speaking in English to another teammate. Yeah. So I think there are translators there. Sometimes they are very needed. Sometimes maybe they are needed to do the media aspect of the communication.
I think Messi does that quite a bit. Yes. Messi speaks English, quite decent English, but gives all of his interviews in Spanish, which is obviously his decision, but he will have a translator.
And more power to him, because it is, when it is a second language, it is just very easy to say the wrong thing, to use a word incorrectly when you think you know what it means, and how quickly that can be taken out of context and pulled apart and signify that you want out of a deal, or you want a new deal, or you're going to retire, or whatever it might be, because you didn't quite get your translation right. I understand why you wouldn't want to put yourself out there. I kind of think Bielsa is another one of those, where he was in England for a good long while before he started like to actually speak English publicly, but by all accounts he spoke English much sooner than maybe he did in a public setting.
I think he used that translator his entire time he was at Leeds. The one I remember is Pochettino. Pochettino, for his first season at Southampton, used a translator, and then all of a sudden for his second season, not only could speak fluent English, but was like charming and like really descriptive and could communicate everything that he wanted. So he learned English very quickly. But Bielsa's translator is an interesting one, Taylor, because you talked about the Sounders having multiple translators for when they won MLS Cup, was that?
Yep.
So was that like a formal press conference setting that they had those translators?
That was in the locker room in the post-match celebrations. But that's a very American thing to have media in the locker room, and I think that might even be an MLS Cup thing at this point.
Yeah, so the point I was trying to make there was I think they might have brought those translators in for that single event. So and what happens there, and I've got a little bit of experience with this going to European press conferences when I used to do that for Scottish teams. A lot of those people will be university lecturers. That's where Celtic and Rangers certainly and Hibs and Hearts would take these translators from. But Bielsa, and this is quite common when you need a day-to-day translator, not someone who's coming in for a special event. His translator was a guy called Andres Clavijo, and he was the coach driver for Leeds. And so it's quite common for a club, if they need a translator, particularly if you're talking about like a Premier League club where it's quite cosmopolitan, Stirling Albion couldn't do this, but to look within their staff, and not just their coaching staff, but the broader staff. By the way, nobody tell Jim Ratcliffe that you can have a coach driver also moonlight as a translator. Everyone will have dual jobs at that club soon enough. But basically, they will use members of staff as translators. So that Andres Clavacco, as I said, was already. It wasn't like he was brought in solely to be Bielsa's translator. He already had I think he did some analysis as well. I don't know how many jobs everyone at Leeds had during the Bielsa era, but he was already on the staff.
So you'll have common language. You'll have coaches who maybe speak a couple different languages to be able to communicate with some players. You might have translators. You do obviously have situations in which players themselves can learn new languages. I think that is much more of a modern, quote unquote, like in the last 20 years thing, because for the longest time, I think like Nicolas Anelka has talked about when he moves to Madrid and how little support there was for a new player moving there. There wasn't a ton of help in terms of getting around the city and finding an apartment, buying a car, and learning the language. And I think that is something that clubs have really started to embrace and connect players with teachers, with people who can help with translation, who can help them learn those languages, because it does feel like a thing that players oftentimes want to do to endear themselves to the supporters by being able to speak the language of the country in which they're playing, but I think also to better facilitate communication and play with their teammates. So I do think you have players more often pursuing that as an option. And by all accounts, I don't speak any languages other than English fluently. But from what I have heard, once you start to learn a language, once that becomes a thing your brain is doing, once you learn a second one, it's easier to learn a third one. Once you learn a third one, it's much easier to learn a fourth one, and so on. And so I think you will then have players, who we'll get to in a second, who once they pick up a second or a third or a fourth, really quickly pick up a fifth, a sixth, or a seventh. And there is obviously some commonality in some languages, but I find that really fascinating that there are certain players who seem to really prioritize picking up languages as they go.
Yeah, there's a good number of polyglot. That's the term, right? For someone who speaks. For polyglot, someone who speaks a number of languages, and there's countless players who are like that in football. But yes, it's very common for clubs to, when they sign a player. I mean, whenever I'm playing Football Manager, I will always send a foreign player on the intensive language course at the cost of like £10,000 to £20,000 at my budget, because they then seem to play better. And look, that's obviously a silly example, and that's a game, but they might be onto something, Football Manager, where those players are able to integrate themselves a little bit quicker. And I know Napoli have done this for Scott McTominay and Billy Gilmore. They're learning Italian. I think Christian Pulisic has spoken about this with Milan as well, and might even have done some TV interviews in Italian recently, or was that Weston McKennie? One of the two, or maybe both, have done some Italian interviews recently. So I guess not every player will put in the same amount of effort, and British players are especially bad for this. As a nation in general, we are terrible at learning other languages, and I very much count myself in this. I did Spanish for 5 years at school, and now can't remember any of it. Yeah. So you get. I mean, my excuse is I'm not in an environment where I'm using that every day. I think that probably does make it quite a bit easier. But you get out of it what you put in, and that applies to football players as well. Exactly,
and I think that can be formalized training or language study, as you mentioned. It can also just be making friends. As I said, Patrice Evra picking up Korean from Park Ji-sung. I think he then kind of formalizes that a bit more. I don't think he's fluent. But Romelu Lukaku is the one that I think pops up on a lot of lists, and he seems to have picked up parts of languages from different teammates, and then really, I think, excels at filling out his fluency in those languages. Like Portuguese is one. I forget which teammate it was that he first started picking up. Maybe it was Bosingwa, but he started picking up a little bit of Portuguese, and then from there moves on to fluency. He has 8 languages, but by what the internet informs me: Dutch, French, Spanish, English, Portuguese, Italian, Flemish, Lingala, which is the language of Congo, and then some Portuguese as well. I'm guessing he is now fluent in Portuguese because he seems to be that good at languages.
Yeah, and Pogba, his best mate as well, I think, is another one I already knew of, that Paul Pogba spoke a bunch of languages. He speaks English, French, Italian, and Spanish. Pa Maduka, who I'm not sure if that's Ryan's boy or Joe's boy now. Maybe they're sharing custody of Ka now that he's the Phoenix Rising head coach, having previously been at Charlotte FC. Apparently, he also speaks 8 languages. He was one that came up in my research. So he speaks Arabic, Dutch, English, French, German, Norwegian, Swedish, and Wolof, which is a language spoken in West Africa. So this has to help them in that dressing room environment. Has surely, certainly with Pogba and Lukaku, has helped them have a real global career and play in different countries and different leagues. And I just find it so impressive when people can switch between different languages. Recently, Philippe Clement, who was recently sacked as the Rangers manager, but he was given a press conference. It was a Europa League press conference earlier in the season, and so it was a European continental opponent. And he was switching between English and French and Dutch. It was just absolutely incredible. It kind of went a little bit viral, which tells you a lot about the ignorance of foreign languages in Britain that did go viral, but it's still very, very impressive.
It is. I think with a lot of these players who have multiple languages, you can sort of you can basically like provide a biography for them based on the languages they speak. Like Lukaku is a good example of this. Zlatan, Henri Mkhitaryan as well. Like Lukaku, born in Belgium, where there are multiple languages spoken as their sort of official language, so he picks up Dutch, French, and Flemish there. But then when he moves around to different clubs, obviously Lingala, the Congolese language, or one of the Congolese languages, is one that he spoke with family members. So you can kind of see where he's born, what his background is, and then his playing career. Henri Mkhitaryan, with that in mind, is the other one that I find really fascinating. So he is Armenian, speaks Armenian. I believe learned French in school, so speaks French. When he was 13, went and did academy training in Brazil for 6 months, so learned Portuguese. Has a Russian grandma, so learned Russian from her. Moved, when he first moved clubs abroad, moved to Ukraine, so he speaks Ukrainian. Then he has Dortmund, so he learned German. Then there's English, and he is now fluent in Italian. And he's another one who I think people didn't know he was learning Italian until suddenly he did a full-on fluent interview in a post-game right on the pitch interview. And I think the interviewers themselves were like, wait, what? You speak Italian now too? So he has got 8 as of 2019. He may have added more to that since then.
So impressive. I've yet to, sorry to take us in a tennis direction here, but in terms of a sports person, I've yet to encounter a sports person or an athlete who can speak more than Novak Djokovic, who speaks 11 different languages apparently. And there was not to give, I'm not one for usually giving Novak Djokovic credit, but there was a press conference that he must have been playing in a tournament in China. And he was sitting next to a fellow player, and the joke was like, "Oh, are you going to speak Chinese now, huh?" And then all of a sudden he breaks into fluent Mandarin or whatever the local dialect of Chinese was.
That's crazy.
Just so incredibly impressive. Apparently he speaks Japanese, Russian, and Arabic as well. So 11 languages. Novak Djokovic.
Those are not easy to learn. The only group of people that I've ever encountered that speak more languages than professional athletes are people trying to sell you things in the Grand Bazaar in Turkey. That is the other one where you walk through there and they try to guess your nationality by saying things to you in languages until you respond. So I always took pride in when they would try. I usually would get Turkish and I would usually get Spanish first before I would get English. And I was always very, very proud of that fact. But hearing a person rattle off sentences in 12 different languages until they land on the one that you speak is kind of insane. You would get English.
I would get the language the minions speak. The Italian that Brad Pitt speaks. Gorlami.
Yeah, there you go. You could get Spanish or Italian. I could see that. Maybe Portuguese.
I'll take that.
You're multinational. Why not?
Thanks.
So in the end, if we're answering this question succinctly, it is a combination of there is nonverbal communication on the football pitch, but then you are getting usually a common language. You will get probably some level of understanding from that in terms of very basic instruction, but you might get, if you are struggling then, you might get translated team talks, translated talking points, and you might have a translator just sitting with you for large stretches. But it's not always required, certainly, and it's not always a thing people pursue. Gareth Bale is probably the prime example of, I'm not going to learn Spanish. I'm going to golf and I'm going to score goals, and that's all I need to do.
The thing is, you're totally right. Gareth Bale is one of the exceptions, and there are exceptions of players who didn't learn local language, and we're absolutely fine. I think it will help most players, actually all players, to learn the local language or the common language of the club that they're playing for. But there are exceptions, and Gareth Bale is one of the most notable ones. What I think is important with Gareth Bale, though, is he was playing for Real Madrid. It was the team he was playing for. So I used Unai Emery. If Gareth Bale was playing for Unai Emery and he's having to take on all this instruction, or if Gareth Bale was playing for Pep Guardiola, again, similar, and he's having to understand exactly what Pep Guardiola is asking him to do in the football pitch. And so the fact he was playing for Real Madrid, who are the most vibesy club in European football, and particularly for an attacking player, for Gareth Bale, it's kind of like, right, just go and play your game. I kind of wonder if he might have struggled at Barcelona, being able to speak a common language more than he did at Real Madrid.
That Makes a ton of sense. That's really fascinating, Graham. I like that idea. All right. So Gareth, so it's basically just be a world-class player who doesn't require much instruction playing for a club where there isn't a ton of tactical instruction, and you'll be fine.
Yeah, play for Real Madrid.
Cool. Okay.
Sign for them. It's easy to sign for Real Madrid. Just do that, and you'll be fine. You can speak English.
My other like life experience when it comes to languages is not one that I would say I would advocate for everyone. Certainly not young people. A drink or two. A drink or two has always helped me. Just like it gives you the liquid confidence, liquid courage. But I think the biggest
fake it till you make it.
no, really, it's more so that I think like I will freeze up. Like I can speak okay Spanish in the right setting. I was hanging out with a friend of mine, and after like this was a long time ago, but I was overserved, is how I will put it.
Sure.
To the point where the next morning, like we had a game. I was much younger because I could stay out late drinking and then wake up to play a game at 9 a.m. But I was like, oh man, I'm sorry, Pedro. Like, I'm sure I tried to speak Spanish to you. And he's like, we had a fluent conversation in Spanish for like 20 minutes. I don't know what you're talking about. So it's more so, I think, for me that I like freeze up and I'm like, oh, wait, is that the wrong tense? Am I using the wrong like pronoun? Like whatever it might be. And I think when you can relax a little bit, and I do think that's probably what being in a football team can provide, is a relaxed setting where like you're going to get teased and like ribbed a little bit if you get the words wrong. But I think there is a kind of convivial spirit of trying to help each other out that I think will help kind of lower those inhibitions a little bit as well. But I think kind of probably having a relaxed environment is what players need in order to maybe then learn those languages and not feel like they're sitting in a classroom about to be tested.
Yeah, I thought you were saying fake it till you make it, like that sign language interpreter at the was that, the Mandela thing like 10 years ago, where they the sign language just made it up.
Yeah, that's good stuff. That's good stuff. I say I forget what the guy's name is. We learned it when I was taking how to teach English abroad lessons. There's like the 70s, I think the 70s Italian guy who wrote a pop song that is just what American pop songs sound like if you don't speak English. It gets used in commercials all the time now, but it really does sound like an American pop song from back then, but there is not a single word of English in it. It is just full-on gibberish. That's a great song, and it has the longest name ever in history, so I cannot remember that. I will try to find it. But for now, Graham Ruthven, any other thoughts on languages spoken, how players communicate, how coaches communicate, all that good stuff?
No, just that more people should learn the language of the structurally unsound, as I have become really skilled at in the last 24 hours, or since Monday night. So yeah, maybe that should be the language that Gareth Bale. Actually, Gareth Bale probably has learned that language given the injury troubles that he had in his career. So that's two of us that know that language. All
right, Adriano Celentano is the singer. The song is "Prison Colonesinin Husinol." That's all one word, but just search Adriano Celentano and it will come up, and it's great. So give that a listen, Graham. Give that a listen, listeners. Graham, ice your back, and I'll talk to you again next week for some more Soccer 101.